We continue on to our weekly segment now, Korea Book Club, where we explore the world of Korean literature through notable recent works in Korean or in English translations. And to help us do that, we have joining us in the studio today cultural essayist Colin Marshall, host of the podcast Korea24 한국, and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지. Colin, hello. It's great to see you again.
Glad to see you, Jung-ho.
Now, Colin, I see that you have in front of you two very similar-looking books, and I understand that one is in Korean and the other is in English.
Yes, I have them, and unlike the last time I did that, one of these books is not, strictly speaking, a translation of the other. That is to say, we have here not the original work of the author and then an interpretation by a translator, but one book written twice, in English and then in Korean, by the very same writer. The writer is called Yun, and the novel is called Unnie, or spelled in the English version, Unnie. This is depending on which edition you're reading.
Sure. Well, first, that is very interesting and impressive as well, that the writer felt that they have enough command of both languages to write the book, the same book twice in different languages. And the title, Unnie, it is, of course, a very common term in the Korean language, but we should explain it for our international listeners, I think, although I'm sure many are already familiar with it through K-dramas and whatnot nowadays.
Indeed, and increasingly, even readers who take their Korean literature in English will have seen the word. Only as a term of address used by women of all ages to refer to their older sisters, technically, but also to other women older than themselves. It comes as one of a set. There's also oppa, which women call their older brothers or men older than themselves, and the equivalents of those terms used by men, which are nuna and hyung. And all of these words, in fact, have in recent years been included in the Oxford English Dictionary. English Dictionary, not Korean. So by no means are they known only in this country, despite being, of course, Korean in origin.
Right.
So we probably, unlike in past translations, won't be seeing them rendered in English as sister and brother much longer.
Right, that was always a bit of an awkward translation.
Yes.
So I think many would agree that this is a welcome change to see such terms like 언니, 오빠, and 형 being left in Korean nowadays.
Yes.
Okay, so the next obvious question then is, what sort of 언니 is this book about? Does the title refer to a literal older sister or an older sister figure more broadly?
This would be a real biological older sister named Park Mina, whose younger sister Park Yun-yong is this novel's narrator. And the opening finds Yun-yong in Noryangjin, a quarter of Seoul widely known as a center of Goshiwon, or these dormitory-like complexes of small, even tiny rooms occupied by students who need to concentrate on just cramming for exams, which they're usually taking in order to receive some kind of professional qualification. Now Mina, this titular Unnie, lived in Noryangjin while studying to qualify as a teacher, and a teacher she became at Danwon High School in Ansan, whose name nobody in Korea can hear now without thinking of the Sewol, the ferry that sank just over 10 years ago, taking more than 300 lives with it, including those of 250 Danwon students on a field trip to Jeju Island. And Mina, it transpires, was not just on that field trip as the teacher, of course, but also one of the passengers who was never ultimately located.
Okay, so that is what this book is about then.
Indeed.
I see in our notes here today that this novel tells the story of two victims of the Sewol disaster, essentially. Mina, the teacher, the missing teacher, but also, in another sense, Yun-young, the sister she's left behind. So the book opens with Yun-young in Noryangjin, where the sister, her Unnie, lived while studying to become a teacher. What is it that Yun-young is perhaps searching for while visiting these locations previously occupied by Mina? Well,
this quest of hers is motivated in part by having checked her family register to find that between her name and Mina's, another name she'd never heard before, Baksu, marked as deceased, who turns out to have been another older sister, another Unnie, who died in a car accident while Mina was supposed to be looking after her. So to find out how the resulting feelings of guilt shaped Mina's life, Yun-young goes as far as to track down her old therapist, who proves surprisingly willing to disclose what they discussed in their sessions. And this discovery also helps Yun-young explain an early chapter of her own life. She never remembered Baksu, she never pursued her sister, but hoping to escape anything that would remind her of this dead second child, their mother insisted that the family move to the United States. But as more than a few Koreans have found out over the decades, emigration can create as many problems as it solves. And not long thereafter came the 1997 Asian financial crisis, known here in Korea as IMF, in reference to the strict economic reforms consequently placed on this country by the International Monetary Fund. It brought down the Korean company for which Yoon Young's father worked in Virginia, in the U.S., forcing them to relocate to a Koreatown somewhere in Maryland and open a fried chicken restaurant. This is not easy work.
Right, so there's a whole section of this book located in the US, you're saying then?
There is, yeah. I think it's more than a chapter, at least a chapter. And as an American myself, one who happened to be in adolescence during this period in question in the 90s, I found these parts particularly fascinating because on one hand, they convey some of the sense of wonder young immigrants must feel upon first experiencing the West. When they arrive in Richmond and Yoon Young asks if the city's name means they'll become rich. And Mina, for her part, thrills to episodes of Saved by the Bell in the original English, not dubbed into Korean like she was watching before. On the other hand, this portrayal of American life doesn't neglect the ways in which that American life can feel inflexible and even punitive. Yoon Young remembers a candy shop owner slamming the window shut in her face at closing time before she could even ask for what she wanted. And when the chicken restaurant's delivery driver gets into a wreck, the family has to spend all the money they'd earned on the resulting legal costs, thus ending their American dream. But it's at school in the U.S. that Yoon Young comes to be known by the nickname Mina gives her, Yoon Yoon, which the astute reader will notice is also what the author calls herself.
Right, okay. So you keep bringing us plot twists in this review today as well. So should we take that as an indication to read this novel as autobiographical then?
It would seem to invite such a reading, but it also includes a note describing the story as an amalgam of the real experiences of various Sewol victims' families.
Right.
So we should also mention that the first thing Yoon Yoon, the writer, mentions in her autobiographical note is that she works as a high school teacher here in Korea. So perhaps she's put some of herself into the character of Yoon Young, but also into that of Mina, the Unnie. And I imagine it's a rare Korean school teacher at any grade level who didn't consider the possibility that it could have been their class on the Sewol, although I doubt that many have followed that line of thought all the way to writing a whole novel about it.
Indeed, this does seem like a very heartfelt work, mixing the personal with the stories of other people, the victims of this Sewol disaster. Now, you've been reading this book over the last couple of weeks as well, and it happened to have coincided with another more recent disaster, the Jeju Air plane crash, of course, that occurred at the very end of last year. Despite its having been published before that accident, I understand that you felt some parallels between the story of this Sewol as told in Unnie and that of Flight 2216.
Yes, when I first got word of the crash that same Sunday morning, I believe it was, the reports I saw said that something like 80 people had died out of about 180 on the plane. That's bad, but when a plane goes down, you don't imagine there will be any survivors. Of course, in the following hours, it emerged that actually everyone aboard had died except for 2 crew members seated at the back. And I thought of all this while reading the chapters of Only, in which Yoon Young and her family go to the port where they're supposed to be reunited with Mina, whose name had initially, and incorrectly, been included on the list of survivors. So when they get there, and for quite some time thereafter, no authorities can provide any reliable information about who's been rescued or who's perished, and reports from the Muan airport described a somewhat similar scene, with the family members there growing angrier and angrier about the apparent lack of announcements or lack of information about what had happened to the flight and whether anyone had survived. And these 2 incidents, the sinking of the Sewol and the Jeju Air crash, seem to fall naturally in line with other disasters that have befallen Korea over the past 30 years or so. The collapse of the Sampung department store in 1995, the Itaewon Halloween crush in 2022. But they also have considerable differences, one versus the other. Accidents in aviation typically occur in very short spans of time, for instance, whereas a ship takes hours to sink. Hours, as emphasized in this book, during which the students' families saw no evidence of a serious rescue operation getting underway. And as we know, some of the parents continued to protest in Gwanghwamun for years after the incident, demanding a more thorough investigation into the cause of the shipwreck. And a decade later, now, some would say we still don't have a complete explanation of exactly what happened that day. And the ongoing investigation into the causes of the Jeju Air crash has also run into obstacles, as I understand it. Maybe we'll never know the single true story of either of those disasters, but there remain the countless many stories of those affected by them, which novels like Onni exist to tell.
Right, so it does seem like this book is perhaps less political than other books about Sewol we've seen in recent years. This book seems more like a moving study in grief. Would that be right?
I was thinking the whole time, like, whenever these incidents happen, these accidents, these disasters happen, we always think if we have no connection to it, if we didn't know anybody involved, we feel relieved that we didn't. But this book does give you the experience of what it would be like if it was your relative on the boat or on the plane.
And did you get to read both the English and Korean versions? Because, as our listeners know, you can do both.
Yes,
how
yes.
do they compare? And why do you think the author decided to write both versions as well? Do we know anything on that? I believe this is her first novel, after all, as well.
It's her first novel. She wrote the English version first, intriguingly, despite being a native Korean speaker. But in the book, she gives this character, Yoon-young, the experience of not just living in the US, but being the best in her family at English. And so she's expected to be perfect at English. They come back to Korea, everybody thinks, oh, you must be like a native speaker. So she writes about how hard that is, because she's still not a native speaker and still struggles with things, and secretly with her sister has to trade tips about English so they can seem like they are perfect English speakers. But writing this book in English first, it almost gives it's written in the first person from Yoon-young's perspective. So it's like it could be a book written in English by this character Yoon-young, who has this background in the US and who has this English consciousness. So in a way, it's almost like you can see two sides of the character if you read both of the books, whose content is the same, pretty much. I mean,
sure.
But it is intriguing that this character and the author, they seem to have the same linguistic sort of life, and it gets expressed in two ways with both of these editions.
Yes, it is very intriguing, as you said, and fascinating to look at. Once again, it's called Unnie by Yoon-young, available both in Korean and English and out now. Well, that's it for our Korea Book Club segment this week. Colin, thank you for that review, as ever, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.
See you next time, Jang-ho.
And that brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you for staying with us. Before we go, we have enough time today to remind you of the various ways to listen to Korea24. You can catch us on our website, world.kbs.co.kr, as well as our apps, KBS Kong, KBS World Radio, and KBS World Radio On Air. KBS World Radio is also available on shortwave in various regions. For full details of frequencies, do check out our website. Meanwhile, you can listen back to all of our previous episodes as a podcast as well. That you can find on various popular podcast platforms. Just search KBS Korea24. And finally, we also have a looped YouTube live stream of KBS World Radio's English language service. So you can catch our daily English language shows throughout the day. Just search for KBS World English on YouTube. And that brings us to the end of our show. We'll be back tomorrow with our Thursday edition of the show. We hope you join us again then. Till then, we hope you have a great day. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.
KBS World Radio